Alright guys, so this video is going to be over evolution, evidence of evolution. We're going to go over a few things that scientists use to support the idea that things change over time. Because remember, that's what evolution is. Evolution is just a change over a period of time, okay? So just like your cell phones, if you've seen some of the cell phones your parents used when they were growing up, you know that they're way different than the ones that you use, right? So again, evolution is just a change over time. Okay, their phones have changed or have evolved just like other organisms in our planet. Okay, so a change in the characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. Evolution here, I want to emphasize that evolution happens at a population level. It doesn't happen to individual organisms. It happens as a population from generation to generation, and it happens just by chance. Okay. Now, populations evolve because of the mutations that are introduced to that population. And if the populations are beneficial, then they will stay in the environment and they will eventually change how those organisms look, and they will change the population, thus causing the species to evolve into another species or just to either more complex or more simple species. But again, evolution is just a change over time, okay? Now, the first evidence we're going to look at is going to be fossil records. And we know that fossil records are the most direct evidence of evolution. And that's because we can look at structures of an organism and actually compare those structures and see how similar they are, okay? So you look at the structures, you see how similar they are, and you can kind of see the changes over time, okay? Now, fossils, we know they're just mineralized remains of organisms. So wherever they die, if the bones or the structures are able to mineralize, then that's going to form fossils, and we're going to have something to look at once we start digging, or once scientists start digging in the area. Now, the fossil record is not complete, and the reason it's not complete is because there's a lot of species that have lived in environments where fossils just can't form. Right? If they die in the near the ocean or on sand, then sand is not a place where fossils are going to be forming, right, because of erosion and other factors. But they just die in places where fossils can't form. Also, some of these organisms die and they decay really fast, so the fossils are not able to form, okay? Now, when we're looking at the record, the fossil record, sometimes we see periods of no change. We keep finding all these fossils that have no changes. Then, out of nowhere, we find this new species, right? A few years later or hundreds of years later, depending on what layer of rock we find it in. But the species doesn't change for a long time, and then it changes suddenly. And the reason for that is because the environment puts these pressures in these organisms to change, right? So if a mutation happens to come up and it favors the new species, and then that species is able to survive better and reproduce better, well, that species is going to stay in that ecosystem, okay? But again, fossil records, the most direct evidence that scientists use for evolution, and we know that is not complete because some organisms just don't fossilize. They don't have the time, or they don't die in the right place. Biogeographic evidence, they also use this, okay? And this is just looking at two organisms, okay, that are isolated, okay? And this is supported by Pangea. Remember that Pangea is the theory of the supercontinent, of how our planet actually started, right, as a supercontinent, and then because of plate tectonics and because of the movement of the plates in our planet, we ended up with different continents, and you can see the continents here, right? But that's biogeographic evidence. So what scientists look at, they look at organisms maybe here in this area of North America, and then they look at these organisms that are here in Africa, and they try to compare how those organisms are similar. They try to see similarities between those two, and in a lot of the cases they do find similarities, especially now that we have access to DNA and we can get the genome of these organisms, okay? So there's two types of evolution when it comes to biogeographic evidence. Or they support two. The first one is divergent evolution, and that's where two species come from a common ancestor. Okay, so down here, if you look at the letters, I use letters because it makes it much easier. Both organisms start as A, or the same organism, but because of the pressures in the environment, okay, because of that, then this one ends up being a T, or a different organism. This one ends up being an S. So yes, they are different organisms, but they come from a common ancestor. Okay, it's just that they diverged somewhere in their evolutionary history because of pressures in the environment. Okay, the other one is going to be uh, convergent evolution, and that one is just two species converting during their history of evolution. Okay, and these two species have similar characteristics, but they do not have a common ancestor. Okay, so they have different ancestors. All right, so I had to step away from my computer. Sorry about that. So yeah, convergent. Okay, convergent evolution. Two species that start out from different ancestors, but they end up looking the same or having the same characteristics, and that's because again, their environment requires them or pressures them to have these characteristics, and only those that have those characteristics are going to survive. So divergent evolution is there. Those two species are going to look different, but they have the common ancestor. Convergent evolution, these two species look similar to each other, but they don't have a common ancestor. This is an example of divergent evolution. Something back here, right? There's a common ancestor to these two species, but they evolved, this species or Homo sapiens evolved in this direction, right? And apes or other types of organisms went on their own direction, okay? And that's called divergent evolution, okay? Now, if we keep going, this is an example of convergent evolution. Okay, cats and owls. Well, they don't have a common ancestor or something that's very close, right? But they do share some characteristics. They have night vision that and directional hearing. So if they hear something, they know exactly where it is. Okay, and they can see very, very, very well at night. So those are characteristics that they develop because of the environment, not because they have a common ancestor. That's convergent evolution. Okay, now let's talk about some homologies. Homologies are just similarities. There's going to be there's three that are used to support this idea that things change over time, and that things have changed or have changed over time and are not the same as they started out as. Okay, and the three similarities are going to be anatomical, molecular, and developmental homologies. And we'll start with anatomical. Anatomical, there's two similarities or two examples. The first one is going to be homologous structures, which are similarities due to common ancestry. Okay, and you can see this because they have the same basic structures. Okay, so that means if you look at these four examples here, all four of them have the same basic structure, right? So that means that they have a common ancestor. We can actually, you can see how they color the bones here, the structures, a specific color, and we can find it in all structures. So they have the same basic structure, so that's a homologous structure. Those are similarities that show common ancestry. Another anatomical homology we call these structures analogous structures. Okay, these are similarities because due to the changes in the organism over time, but not because of ancestry. Okay, they don't have a common ancestor. I guess if you go far back, if we go way, way back, yes, we can find a common ancestor to everything, but they don't have a close common ancestor. Okay, and okay, so like the butterfly here, well, it developed wings because its environment required it to have wings. The bat also developed wings because it needs wings to survive, but that doesn't mean they are closely related to each other. Okay, they have the same characteristics, but they don't share a common ancestor. Okay, they're not closely related to each other. Now, molecular homologies, these are similarities in the amino acids. Okay, acid sequence in two organisms, and you can look at these organisms and actually identify which ones are closer to each other. Okay, by just comparing the amino acids, you can see that the horse and the human have one difference. Okay, the horse and the chicken have two differences. So if we were just looking at this section of DNA, which is cytochrome C, right, we would say that the horse and the human are more closely related to each other than the horse and the chicken. And that's just looking at the cytochrome C amino acid sequence. This is just one chunk of DNA, right? All right, so those are molecular homologies when we look at the amino acid sequences, okay? Developmental homologies, these are just similarities as organisms develop, okay? And you can kind of look at this picture. It's a very old picture, but this is what they use to support the idea that things do change over time and that organisms kind of start developing the same way. And as they grow older or as they develop, then because of cell differentiation and the proteins we produce, we become who we are, okay? All vertebrates, through our labs, we know that we all share a tail. We start out with a tail. We lose it as we develop, humans, right? We have a notochord, cord, which is the backbone, a nerve cord, which is runs in your backbone, right? And pharyngeal pouches that eventually develop into limbs in us, right? Now, so we talked about evidence of evolution and what evolution was, but how fast or how slow evolution happens, well, that depends on a lot of factors, but one way to explain this is punctuated equilibrium, okay? And what punctuated equilibrium says is that organisms change, they suddenly change, right? So this one starts off, there's no change for a while, but then here something happens in the environment that it splits into two, right? And this one is not going to change for a while. It's going to keep going. But this one is going to change again. It's going to split, right? The original one is going to keep going. The other one is going to change. And what that's going to cause is speciation, which is the creation of a new species. Okay, that's all speciation is. And punctuated equilibrium just says that there's not change for a while, and then suddenly there's going to be a change. And that's why we see changes like this in the fossil record as well. Okay, because there's periods where there's no pressure on these organisms to change, so the mutations that come up are not favorable, so there's no changing of the species. Another way to explain the change in evolution is stasis, which is just a state of no change. Crocodiles have not changed in years. Okay, they're still the same organism that used to be here a long time ago. And the reason for that is because they're well adapted to their environment. There's no need or pressure on these organisms to change. Okay, and that's stasis. And we can see this in fossil records. When you start looking at the fossil records, there's periods of when there's no change for a long, long time, and that's called stasis. Okay, and that's because these organisms didn't have any pressures from the environment to change, so the mutations that showed up didn't stay in the population because they weren't favored. Okay. All right. So that's the three types of evolution, evidence of evolution that we need to look at: fossil records, biogeographical evidence, and homologies, which are similarities. Okay. Make sure you understand punctuated equilibrium and stasis as well. Okay. If you need any help, let me know.